I imagine it this way. She's in a room overlooking a lake, and she gazes out over its expanse. But the question in her heart is even larger than Lake Michigan, which rolls out before her. She's thinking about her newborn baby daughter, a baby so calm that they use her to demonstrate how to diaper a baby. The baby is much more placid than her mother's heart is, because scraps and bits of the story about what's happening in Cuba that day are wafting into the room with every visitor, and a lot of speculations are coming in too, speculations about what President Kennedy is doing, what he will do. The year is 1962. Our nation is in the middle of what will be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. What have I done, she asks herself. What business do I have bringing a baby into this world? Now today, I want to suggest three things. First, that in our world, we face real dragons. And second, that all parents, no matter what their circumstance, deserve our support. And third, that if we truly love a child, we have to be willing to help change the world. We face real dragons. How many of us have asked that question, as my poor mother did, contemplating me, her newborn baby, in my earliest hours? We've all faced it, I think, somewhere out along the road of parenthood. We've faced wondering how it will turn out for the children we love, even if they are not related to us by blood, but only by friendship and by care and kinship. Here be dragons, the old map makers used to say, in the areas that were uncharted or unknown on those old maps. Today, many parents of all gender orientations find themselves facing dragons lurking and endangering, against which they feel pretty ill-equipped. I'll say that as an I statement. Against which I feel pretty ill-equipped, because dragons are real. They really are. Every age has its dragons. I was trying to remember and imagine this week what it would be like to be a parent in 1832 when a major union in New England condemned the use of child labor for the very first time. It would take more than half a century before a minimum age law for work was passed, and then more than 100 years before there was any kind of real federal regulation of child labor. That didn't even happen until 1938. Now, we can sit here today as parents in 2013 and feel pretty smug about that, but I wonder how many of us missed that little wisp of dragon smoke last month when the international agency, UNICEF, ranked the U.S. at the bottom of a table of the best places to raise a child. The ABC coverage of this story gave this succinct conclusion. Despite being the 7th richest country in the world, the U.S. has had some of the worst rates for teenage pregnancy, homicide, and childhood obesity. Lack of education, the costs of health care, and teenage pregnancies are putting the life chances of American children at the bottom of a table of overall well-being, far behind those of much poorer countries. Here be dragons. And these are dragons that our children may know far, far better than we do. Because dragons lurk. Alex Lortz knows dragons. He's a teenager in Ventura, California, and he became a climate change activist when he was 12. And last year, when he was a high school senior, he became the lead plaintiff in the first global warming lawsuit of its kind. It was filed by teenagers in all 50 states against federal agencies and manufacturers, and the claim was that their generation's future is being jeopardized by U.S. business interests that keep polluting despite the evidence of climate change. It's not only a moral but a legal responsibility for the government to protect the atmosphere for future generations, Alex said last year, right before his court case came up. And Nathan Haig, he's a would-be Eagle Scout who lives in Utah where he has a high GPA. He serves on the student council. He's a swimmer. He's probably like a lot of the kids you know, and also, unfortunately, probably like a lot of the kids you know, he has a secret that he's kept from his family and friends for many of his teenage years, which is that he has an addiction to online pornography, which it is now believed is epidemic among teenage boys. Nathan said his habit of looking at pornography on the internet started when he was about 12. I became almost numb to it, he said. It was pretty much just part of my daily routine. It was just what I did every day automatically. And Mary Hooks knows dragons. She's a young Southern black woman, and she works with young women in her community to teach them what she calls the sacred no. And it's tied to giving them reproductive choice and allowing them, and not the government, to decide who they call family. Other dragons lurk as well, and I know this all too well. Despite nearly half a century of women's lib, the dragon of misogyny means that I have to explain to my 13-year-old son why a certain type of clothing is called a wife beater, and why it's not okay to use a compound word which begins with the word mother and ends with the word that rhymes for the name of someone who drives a truck. It's funny, and it's not. And too many of our kids know the dragon of gun violence. Columnist Annie Goddard wrote this: "If you consider law enforcement to be a dangerous occupation, it turns out that it's not nearly as perilous as being a young child in our nation. Almost twice as many preschool-age children die from gun violence every year than police officers killed in the line of duty." So I want to pause here, because this is a lot. And this is the reason why my sermon ended up with the title that it did, Parenting as Dragon Slaying. But I want to acknowledge that my sermon title has the flaw of appearing to promote violence and the senseless extermination of cute mythological creatures, such as the one on the cover of your order of service, which was actually drawn by my daughter for the room of for my son's nameplate on his room. So I'm not trying to promote that. And in fact, I remember that the central lesson of How to Train Your Dragon, which was a favorite of my household, has not actually escaped me. In that film, the society which is obsessed with slaying dragons actually learns how to tame them and how to channel their energy by understanding more about what it means to be a dragon, overcoming their ignorance. And that's important, because I do believe that understanding over the long term will be the aid to many of our issues that we face. It's important to remember that those old map makers said, "Here be dragons." They labeled them as dragon lands, those places that were uncharted and unknown. We need to start with understanding. We need to start with understanding the worlds, the actual worlds that our children inhabit. Author Mila Kabat-Zinn writes about mindful parenting. And the first thing that she recommends is to try to picture in your mind a child for whom you love and care. She writes, try to imagine the world from that child's point of view, what it feels like what it looks like, what they face in the world every day. Do this every day, she says, for at least a few moments, to try to be able to better walk with that child. And we need to do that. We need to understand the world that our children live in today, not the world that we necessarily grew up in. Conformity in the 1950s and even part of the 1960s meant obeying all the rules and being stifled by them for many. But conformity in 2013 means breaking all the rules, and that can be deadly, especially for our young men and boys. We parents need to remember that being cool to our kids is not as important as setting the limits that will keep them safe. And we can lend understanding, not judgment, to all parents. Families have always come in all stripes, in many stripes, and we cannot condemn the young mother, the adopting gay couple, the now single mother who knows that her child is better off in that household than they were before. We can be that calm soul of all things to the parents that the rest of the world fails to see or support. And if you love a child, then it is important to be prepared and willing to help change the world. You know, the signature for liberal parents for many years has been the hands-off approach. It's one of the reasons why many parents of color have told me over the years that they don't want their children raised in our congregations, because they teach our children that if you have a cute face or an exceptional intellect or a free-thinking mind, you can do anything that you want. And these parents know that that's not enough. The dragons we face might mean we need a more engaged way of parenting. Kabat-Zinn puts it this way. She says, there are very important times when we need to practice being clear, strong, and unequivocal with our children. Let this come as much as possible out of awareness and generosity and discernment, rather than out of fear and self-righteousness and the desire to control. But mindful parenting does not mean, she says, being overindulgent, neglectful, or weak, nor does it mean being rigid or controlling. Dragons are real. And in a dragon-riddled world, all families need support. In honor of this Mother's Day, change some little part of the world where you can. Turn off the television for an hour and try to get a kid to do something else, or pull them away from the computer. Figure out a way that maybe one day a week, all of you will use the car less and help our environment more. Call your legislators and demand immigration reform that's not about ridiculous demands on our most vulnerable families. Or demand that they acknowledge that it is beyond stupidity to suggest that we need assault weapons to be safe and protect our Constitution. Speak up when someone at the PTO meeting hints something is a little off with that lesbian couple. Don't ask why a single working mom couldn't make her marriage work. Tell her you admire her for getting through her days. Help a kid bake something, or make something, or protest something. These simple acts might not change the world. Doing nothing will not change the world. You know, I'm sorry that my mother had to spend some of the very first hours of my life being anxious about my future. I'm glad she cared enough to worry. Some might say that love is not rational, that hope is downright irrational, and that anyone who brings a child into this broken world needs to have their head examined. But you know, maybe, just maybe, It might be that love and hope are something beyond the rational, something on a plane of greater truth that speaks to a place of understanding that we have yet not realized. So let us be willing to see the dragons, to fight the real threats to our children. Let us be willing to support all families fighting real dangers in this sometimes harsh world. And let us always remember that to love a child is to be willing to help change the world. And let our knowing and our awareness and our love and our commitment guide our feet on the journey ahead.